In an age where empires collided and cultures bled into one another, one island stood at the center of it all: Sicily, the jewel of the Mediterranean, a land both blessed and cursed by its position. Conquered by Greeks, ruled by Romans, invaded by Vandals, reclaimed by Byzantines, transformed by Muslims, and crowned by Norman kings, this island has worn more crowns than any other in Europe. Yet beneath the mosaics and monuments lies a brutal truth. Sicily's beauty was forged in conquest. What began as a tribal land of Sicels, Elymians, and Sicanians soon became a battleground for some of the greatest powers in human history. From the merchant fleets of Carthage to the siege towers of Rome, from Arab emirs to Viking-descended Norman lords, every empire wanted Sicily, but none could hold it for long. In this episode, we uncover how this island, barely visible on the map, became the epicenter of ancient power struggles, religious revolutions, and cultural fusions. This is not just the story of an island, it is the story of the entire Mediterranean, told through the battles, betrayals, and brilliance of those who ruled Sicily. Welcome to the saga of Sicily, Crossroads of Civilizations. It was never just an island. Sicily was the axis on which Mediterranean history turned. Long before the Romans or the Normans, its strategic location placed it at the heart of conquest, trade, and empire. Today, it is Italian, but for over 2,000 years, it belonged to no one for long. Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, has always held a weight disproportionate to its size. Strategically located at the center of the sea that connected Africa, Asia, and Europe, it became a nexus of commerce, migration, and military ambition. To understand why Sicily has changed hands more than almost any other place in Europe, one must begin not with its conquerors, but with its position. Located just south of the Italian peninsula and within reach of North Africa and the Near East, Sicily served as a natural bridge and a point of control. Whoever held Sicily held the crossroads of Mediterranean trade and naval power. Graham A. Loud, professor of medieval history at the University of Leeds, author of Roger II and the Creation of the Kingdom of Sicily, writes about it. Sicily's geopolitical centrality ensured that it was never peripheral in the politics of the Mediterranean world. Every regional power, Greek, Roman, Arab, Norman, competed for it, not as a colonial outpost, but as a keystone of dominance. The island's early geography contributed to its desirability. It boasted fertile plains like the Val di Mazzara and the Val di Noto, capable of sustaining large agricultural outputs, particularly grain and olives. Its coastline offered natural harbours: Palermo in the north, Syracuse in the east, and Trapani in the west, all of which would serve as gateways for successive waves of trade and invasion. Before conquest, before colonization, there were the first people of Sicily, the Sicani, Elymians, and Sicels. These were the indigenous populations of the island, whose origins remain partially obscured, but who formed the first cultural foundations of Sicily. The Sicani, possibly Iberian in origin, occupied the central and western regions. The Elymians, whose roots may reach back to the Aegean, held the northwest, founding cities like Segesta and Eryx. The Sicels, arriving last, settled primarily in the east and were likely related to Italic peoples such as the Onotrians of Calabria. Henri Bresque, former professor at Université Paris-Nanterre, author of Une histoire de la Sicile from 1994, observes, Sicily's first identity was not forged in stone or text, but in diversity. Long before the Greeks arrived, it was already a land of multiple languages, beliefs, and customs, a prototype of the pluralism that would define its future. These peoples did not exist in isolation. By the late Bronze Age, Sicily was already part of a wider cultural network. Archaeological evidence, including Mycenaean pottery and Nuragic bronzes, reveals contact with both the Greek Aegean and the central Mediterranean. The Beaker culture, known for their distinctive pottery and megalithic tombs, left traces in western Sicily, possibly indicating early waves of migration from the Iberian Peninsula. By the 13th century BC, proto-urban settlements began to appear, hints of the coming transformation. Sicily was not merely a land of scattered tribes, it was developing into a landscape of fortified hilltop towns, with social stratification, trade, and regional alliances. Sarah Davis Secord, Associate Professor at the University of New Mexico, author of Where Three Worlds Met Sicily in the Early Medieval Mediterranean, remarks, "What makes Sicily exceptional is not simply the number of civilizations that arrived, but how early the island developed the infrastructure to absorb them. Its hybrid urbanism predates the colonial overlays of later centuries. The island's central location attracted not only settlers, but invaders. The Phoenicians, Semitic traders from Tyre and Sidon, were among the first to establish lasting colonies. As early as the 11th century BC, they settled on the western coasts, founding trading posts at Motia, Solunto, and Palermo. These settlements were not large, but they were highly strategic, designed to protect shipping lanes between North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. At first, their relationship with native Elymians appears to have been cooperative. The cultural fusion that emerged has been labelled by archaeologists as the West Phoenician identity, a hybrid expression of trade, belief, and politics. Hiroshi Takayama, Professor of History at the University of Tokyo, author of Sicily and the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages, writes about those events. The early Phoenician settlements on Sicily's western shore were not merely colonial footholds, they were nodes in a civilizational network that stretched from Tyre to Cadiz. Sicily was both terminus and origin, but while the Phoenicians claimed the west, the Greeks were arriving in the east. Beginning in the 8th century BC, Hellenic settlers established a chain of poleis, city-states, along Sicily's eastern and southern coasts. The most prominent was Syracuse, founded by Corinthians in 734 BC, which would grow to rival Athens and Sparta in wealth and power. Other major colonies included Naxos, Akragas, Selinunte, and Himera. The Greeks brought with them monumental architecture, alphabetic literacy, and competitive civic politics. Their arrival marked a new era, classical Sicily. But it also introduced a deep fault line between the Western Phoenician world and the Eastern Greek world, a line that would become militarized in the centuries to follow. Stephen R. Epstein, former professor at the London School of Economics, author of An Island for Itself, Economic Development and Social Change in Late Medieval Sicily. Sicily's geography imposed upon it a double colonization, Greek and Phoenician, that created not only a frontier of cultures, but a corridor of exchange. This duality was both its strength and its curse. This balance of power was unstable. As both the Greek and Phoenician colonies grew, they came into direct competition, first economically, then militarily. By the 6th century BC, Carthage, the dominant Phoenician city in North Africa, began to assert control over the western settlements in Sicily. This set the stage for a centuries-long conflict between Carthage and the Greek cities, particularly Syracuse. These early power struggles underscore a deeper truth about Sicily's strategic fate. Its riches were inseparable from its vulnerability. The island could feed entire fleets, supply timber and metals, and host key harbours. But its very openness to the sea meant it could never be insulated from external ambition. Carmelina Urso, Professor of Medieval History at the University of Catania, specialist in Sicilian institutional history, writes, "Sicily was the antechamber of empire. Every ruler who sought the Mediterranean throne passed through its ports. Its landscape was never neutral. It was a battlefield of imperial ideologies." By the end of the 5th century BC, Sicily had become one of the most militarized and urbanized regions in the Mediterranean. The balance between Greek, Phoenician, and native influences shaped a complex mosaic of identities and loyalties, one that would be shattered and remade many times in the centuries ahead. But one thing was already clear: Sicily was not marginal. It was essential. And that status, its centrality in the ancient world, would only grow as Rome began to rise. Sicily's history does not begin with conquest. It begins with position. Long before legions or lords, its geography shaped its destiny. Like Fernand Braudel said in his first sentence in his monumental work, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World, in the age of Philip II, mountains came first, and as the empires of Greece and Carthage grew restless, Sicily would become the proving ground for the first great contest of Mediterranean supremacy. To many, Greek history begins in Athens, and Phoenician history ends in Carthage, but for centuries their fates collided on a single island. This is the untold chapter where colonists became kings and where trade turned into total war. By the dawn of the 8th century BC, Sicily had already witnessed a complex layering of tribal societies, foreign traders, and hybrid settlements. But the arrival of the Greeks and Phoenicians marked a turning point, not only in Sicily's development, but in the very nature of Mediterranean power. The island was no longer just a crossroads. It was now a divided frontier, with the Phoenicians of the west and the Greeks of the east laying down parallel visions of civilization, culture, and control. The first Greek settlement in Sicily was founded in 734 BC at Syracuse by colonists from Corinth. Its harbour, fertile hinterland, and strategic location made it an ideal stronghold. It would go on to become the most powerful city in the Western Greek world. Within a generation, a wave of further colonies followed: Naxos, Zancle, later Messina, Gela, Akragas, Selinunte, Camarina, and Himera. These were not mere trading outposts. They were full city-states, or poleis, complete with agora, acropolis, temples, and coinage. The Greek cities in Sicily quickly developed their own political identities and rivalries, often independent from their mainland mother cities. Graham A. Loud writes, "The city-states of Sicily were not simple extensions of Hellenic civilization. They were its testing ground. Here, away from the constraints of mainland tradition, Greek political experimentation reached its most dynamic form. The Greek presence in Sicily soon reshaped the cultural and demographic makeup of the island. Native Sicels, Sicani, and Elymians were pushed inland or absorbed. Over time, many of their towns adopted Greek urban forms and religious practices. The landscape of eastern Sicily, once tribal, now bore the unmistakable architectural and cultural stamp of the Hellenic world. Henri Bresque remarks, "The Hellenization of Sicily was neither abrupt nor absolute. It unfolded through economic dependence, intermarriage, and the silent conquest of language, law, and religion." Temples dedicated to Apollo, Demeter, Hera, and Zeus rose across the island, particularly in Akragas, where the Valley of the Temples remains among the most impressive ruins in the Mediterranean. Coins minted in Syracuse and Gela reflected both Greek mythology and local identity, often depicting the nymph Arethusa, sacred to Sicily. Long before the Greeks arrived, the Phoenicians, maritime traders from Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, had already begun establishing outposts in western Sicily. From the 11th century BC, they sailed across the Mediterranean, founding strategic colonies at Motia, Solunto, and Palermo. Motia, located on a small island near modern Marsala, became one of the most important Phoenician sites west of Carthage. Archaeological evidence shows a thriving community with Semitic temples, craft production, and extensive trade links with both native Elymians and North African ports. Unlike the Greek cities, the Phoenician settlements in Sicily were smaller and more commercially oriented, often built in cooperation with redateurs, but rather than domination over local peoples. Hiroshi Takayama observes, Phoenician Sicily reveals a different model of expansion, less focused on conquest and more on connectivity. Their cities were not imperial metropoles, but mediators between Africa, Iberia, and the central Mediterranean. By the 6th century BC, these Phoenician cities fell under the growing hegemony of Carthage, the dominant Punic power in North Africa. From that point forward, the western half of Sicily became a Carthaginian protectorate, politically dependent on Carthage, but retaining significant local autonomy. As Greek and Phoenician settlements expanded, conflict became inevitable. The island's interior, once home to indigenous peoples, became a contested zone. This led to the development of what scholars describe as a cultural frontier, not simply a line of military engagement, but a shifting boundary of language, religion, economy, and identity. Sarah Davis Secord, associate professor at the University of New Mexico, writes in her book, Where Three Worlds Met, Sicily's frontier between the Greek East and Punic West was porous, violent, and fertile. It was the site of wars, yes, but also marriages, markets, and moments of exchange that defied imperial agendas. The Greek-Punic rivalry intensified in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. Wars broke out between Carthaginian forces and Greek city-states, especially Syracuse, Selinunte, and Himera. The pivotal Battle of Himera in 480 BC, in which Greek forces defeated a Carthaginian army, echoed the Greek victory over Persia at Salamis in the same year, giving it symbolic importance in the wider Greek world. But Carthage would return. In the late 5th and 4th centuries BC, it launched repeated invasions, sacking cities like Selinunte and Akragas. Meanwhile, Greek cities turned toward autocracy. Tyrants such as Galo, Hiero I, and Dionysius the Elder emerged in Syracuse, centralizing power to meet the external threat. Carmelina Urso remarks, "Warfare did not destroy Sicilian democracy, it transformed it." Faced with Carthaginian incursions, civic assemblies yielded to strongmen, creating a tradition of strategic tyranny that persisted into the Hellenistic and Roman periods. The tyrants invested heavily in military infrastructure, building fortifications, hiring mercenaries, and developing naval fleets. At the same time, they patronized art, theatre, and science. Under Dionysius I, Syracuse became a major intellectual center. Archimedes, though living later, would be the island's most famous scientific son. Sicilian Greek cities were never fully isolated from mainland politics. Syracuse, in particular, projected power well beyond the island. In 415 BC, during the Peloponnesian War, Athens launched the infamous Sicilian expedition, a massive naval campaign to conquer the island. The failure of that campaign marked the beginning of Athens' decline. Stephen R. Epstein, economic historian and author of An Island for Itself, writes, "The Athenian disaster in Sicily was not merely a military defeat. It was a failure to understand the complexity of a region where wealth, autonomy, and local loyalties outweighed even the promise of empire." Sicily had become a world of its own. Not entirely Greek, not entirely Carthaginian, and no longer tribal. It was a crucible of city-states, mercantile networks, and military rivalries. By the early 3rd century BC, the island's balance of power began to shift once again. As Greek cities weakened and Carthage advanced, a new force, the Roman Republic, would be drawn into the Sicilian conflict. What began as colonization was now escalating into a larger imperial war, the first phase of Rome's western expansion. In Sicily, the Greeks built cities of marble and ideas. The Phoenicians built ports of trade and endurance, but the peace could not last. Their rivalry turned an island into a battlefield, and their presence set the stage for the Punic Wars. In the next chapter, Rome enters the fray, and Sicily becomes its first overseas province. In the 3rd century BC, a new power emerged from the Italian mainland. Its legions were untested, its navy unproven. But the moment Rome set foot in Sicily, the island's fate and the fate of the entire western Mediterranean changed forever. By 300 BC, the balance of power in Sicily had reached a critical point. Greek city-states, exhausted by centuries of internal strife and Carthaginian assault, stood vulnerable. Carthage, entrenched in the island's west, now viewed Sicily as a critical frontier of its African empire. Into this volatile landscape stepped a new force, the Roman Republic. The Romans did not initially seek an overseas empire. Their rise had been inward-facing, centered on consolidating control over the Italian peninsula. But a small crisis in the northeastern corner of Sicily would spiral into a series of wars that would transform Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean hegemon. In 264 BC, the city of Messana, modern-day Messina, became the focal point of a geopolitical chain reaction. The Mamertines, a band of Italic mercenaries who had seized the city decades earlier, were now under threat from the powerful city of Syracuse. In desperation, they appealed to both Rome and Carthage for protection. Carthage responded first, seizing the nearby straits. But the Mamertines also courted Rome, a risky move, as Rome had no prior claims on Sicily. The Roman Senate hesitated. The island lay beyond traditional Roman influence, and yet strategic logic prevailed. Rome sent troops. Adrian Goldsworthy, historian of Roman military history in the fall of Carthage, the Punic Wars 265 to 146 BC, writes, "The decision to intervene in Sicily marked the beginning of Roman imperialism. What began as a reluctant expedition became an irreversible commitment to maritime expansion. Carthage, feeling betrayed by the Mamertines and threatened by Roman involvement, declared war. Thus began the First Punic War, a conflict that would rage for 23 years and be fought largely in and around Sicily. The First Punic War was a brutal test of endurance between two systems, Rome's republican militarism and Carthage's mercantile empire. Initially, Rome was outmatched at sea. Carthage had centuries of naval experience, Rome virtually none, but the Romans adapted quickly, constructing fleets based on captured Carthaginian ships and developing a new naval innovation, the corvus, a boarding bridge that transformed sea battles into infantry confrontations, playing to Rome's strengths. Major battles occurred at Mylae, Ecnomus, and Drepana. Sicily became the battleground of two empires. Cities changed hands, fortresses were besieged, armies marched through familiar Greek landscapes under the banners of unfamiliar masters. Dexter Hoyos, professor of classics at the University of Sydney, in his book The Carthaginians, writes, "Sicily was the anvil on which Roman and Carthaginian military capacity were hammered into form. Neither side expected the war to last decades, but both became addicted to the struggle. The war took a severe toll on the island. Fertile lands were scorched, entire populations were displaced. As in many imperial conflicts, the interests of local Sicilian cities were often secondary to the larger goals of Rome or Carthage." Henri Bresque, medievalist and author of Une histoire de la Sicile, adds, "For the Sicilian cities, the Punic Wars were less a matter of liberation or conquest than of survival between giants." Theirs was a war of endurance, not ideology. By 241 BC, Rome's persistence and adaptability at sea finally yielded results. After a decisive naval victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, Carthage sued for peace. The Treaty of Lutatius forced Carthage to abandon all claims in Sicily and pay a crippling indemnity. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, Provincia Sicilia. It would not be the last. The Roman conquest did not immediately bring peace or prosperity. The island remained divided, traumatized, and unstable. Cities like Syracuse, under the aged King Hiero II, retained a degree of autonomy by allying with Rome. Others suffered heavy taxation, forced disarmament, or confiscation of lands. Graham A. Loud writes, "The Roman administration in Sicily was pragmatic and extractive. It viewed the island primarily as a source of grain and revenue, an attitude that foreshadowed the structure of future provinces. Grain shipments from Sicily became vital to the food supply of Rome. The creation of large latifundia, massive agricultural estates worked by slaves, transformed the landscape and economy of the island. The earlier diversity of urban life gave way to a more rural and economically stratified society. This transformation had cultural consequences. Despite being a Roman province, Sicilian Greek culture remained strong, particularly in literature, religion, and civic identity. Many cities continued using Greek as their administrative and spoken language for generations. The second act of the Punic saga brought war back to Sicily. In 218 BC, Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps and invaded Italy. While most of the conflict took place on the mainland, Sicily again became a strategic concern. Rome feared that Carthage would attempt to reclaim its former stronghold. In 214 BC, after the death of Hiero II, his successor Hierovanus defected from the Roman alliance. Rome responded with force, laying siege to Syracuse, one of the most fortified and wealthy cities in the Mediterranean. The defense was masterminded by the brilliant engineer Archimedes, who devised siege engines, mirrors, and catapults that held back Roman forces for 2 years. But in 212 BC, the city fell. In the chaos, Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier, despite orders to spare him. Sarah Davis Secord writes, "The death of Archimedes symbolized the end of an era, the passing of the Greek city-state as the locus of power in Sicily, and the ascendancy of Roman militarism. Carthaginian hopes of reclaiming Sicily faded. By 210 BC, the last Carthaginian forces were expelled. The Roman consul Marcus Valerius Laevanus reportedly declared to the Senate that no Carthaginian remains in Sicily. The war was over. Sicily, now firmly Roman, would remain under Roman control for the next 6 centuries. In the centuries following the Punic Wars, Sicily became a stable and essential province of the Roman Republic, and later the Empire. Its role as a granary was formalized. Roads, ports and aqueducts were built. Cities like Catania, Syracuse and Palermo flourished as administrative and trade centers, and yet Sicily was never fully Romanized. Its Greek roots endured in architecture, education and elite culture. Arnold J. Toynbee, legendary British historian of civilizations, in A Study of History, Volume 4, writes, "Sicily remained a cultural hybrid, an island whose Roman skin barely concealed its Hellenic soul. It absorbed conquest without ever fully yielding to it, but the Punic Wars had left permanent scars. The legacy of destruction, the rise of latifundia, and the collapse of local autonomy would shape Sicily's later experiences under Byzantine, Islamic, and Norman rule. The Punic Wars made Rome an empire, and they made Sicily its proving ground. From the death of Archimedes to the rise of grain barons, the island was remade in the image of imperial ambition, but peace would not last. As Roman power grew bloated and unstable, Sicily would again find itself at the heart of collapse, invasion, and transformation. When the Western Roman Empire fell, chaos swept across Europe. But one island remained tethered to a different vision, to an empire that refused to die. In Sicily, Roman order endured, not in ruins, but in Greek. In the late 5th century AD, as Germanic kingdoms carved up the western provinces of the Roman Empire, Sicily stood at a crossroads between continuity and collapse. Geographically Italian, culturally Greek, and politically Roman, the island occupied a unique position in the crumbling imperial world. When the Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 AD, Sicily did not become a barbarian kingdom. Instead, it remained tethered, tenuously, to the vision of empire that lived on in the east, the Byzantine Empire. But this transition was not immediate. The century between the fall of Rome and the full reabsorption of Sicily into the Byzantine world was one of shifting alliances, foreign invasions, and imperial reassertion. Sicily first entered the post-Roman world through a backdoor, the sea. In 440 AD, the Vandals, a Germanic people who had crossed from Hispania into North Africa, launched a naval raid on Sicily. Their ultimate goal was Carthage, which they captured the following year. But Sicily, rich and poorly defended, remained within reach of their galleys. After failed raids in 440 and again in 455, the Vandals finally occupied parts of Sicily in the 460s, likely using the island as a forward base for their piracy and logistical support. However, their control was tenuous and short-lived. John Bagnell Berry Regius, professor of modern history at Cambridge, writes in his book History of the Later Roman Empire, "The Vandal occupation of Sicily was more parasitic than administrative. Their presence left scars of disruption, but no real structure. Theirs was a conquest of absence, of what Rome no longer defended." By the late 470s, power shifted again. Odoacer, the Germanic warlord who deposed the last Western Roman emperor, extracted tribute from Sicily while recognizing Vandal claims. But his own rule was cut short by the rise of Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths. In 491 AD, Theodoric's forces defeated the Vandals at Lilybaeum and brought all of Sicily under Ostrogothic control. The island became part of the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy, which claimed continuity with Roman institutions even as it substituted Gothic dominance for imperial oversight. Peter Heather, professor of medieval history at King's College London in The Restoration of Rome, writes, "The Ostrogothic regime in Sicily was not barbarian anarchy, but a deliberate masquerade of Roman rule, Roman in law, Gothic in arms." For several decades, Sicily enjoyed relative peace and modest prosperity under Theodoric. Gothic officials governed alongside Roman elites, taxes were collected, and trade with the eastern Mediterranean continued. Yet this calm would not last. In 535 AD, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I launched a massive military campaign to reconquer the former western provinces. His general, Belisarius, landed in Sicily that same year. The island, with its strategic harbours and minimal Gothic garrisons, fell quickly. Cities such as Palermo, Catania, and Syracuse surrendered with little resistance. Justinian saw Sicily not merely as a province to recover, but as a staging ground for the campaign to retake Italy. From Sicilian ports, Belisarius moved swiftly northward to Naples, Rome, and Ravenna. Averil Cameron, professor of late antique and Byzantine history at Oxford, writes in his well-known book The Mediterranean World, in late antiquity, Sicily was the key that opened the gates of Italy. In the Byzantine imagination, its recovery was both practical and symbolic, a resurrection of Roman universality. However, the war dragged on. The Ostrogothic counteroffensive under Totila reversed many of Belisarius's gains. In 550, Totila invaded Sicily and briefly retook parts of the island, sacking towns and plundering Roman garrisons. But his success was short-lived. In 552, the Byzantine general Narses defeated and killed Totila at the Battle of Taganai, re-establishing imperial control over the peninsula and Sicily. From that point forward, Sicily remained under Byzantine rule for nearly 3 centuries, becoming a critical western outpost of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine administration organized Sicily into a theme, a military-governed province that combined civil and defense functions. Its capital, Syracuse, became the island's main urban and administrative center. Latin gradually gave way to Greek as the language of both governance and worship. The Byzantine Rite replaced the older Latin liturgy in many churches. John Julius Norwich, historian and Byzantinist in Byzantium, writes, by the 7th century Sicily was no longer Latin in soul. It had become Byzantine, Greek-speaking, icon-venerating, and tethered to Constantinople by administration, trade, and faith. Sicily was valued for its agricultural output, its position along key sea lanes, and its role as a buffer zone against Lombard and later Arab incursions. The Byzantine emperors invested heavily in fortifications, naval patrols, and religious infrastructure. In 663 AD, the Emperor Constans II made the extraordinary decision to relocate from Constantinople to Syracuse, using it as a base to reassert imperial control in Italy. His move was politically symbolic, but also deeply unpopular. Warren Treadgold, professor of Byzantine studies at St. Louis University, writes in his book A History of the Byzantine State and Society, Constans' migration to Syracuse marked the last imperial attempt to reorient the empire westward. It failed not because of policy, but because the West no longer desired salvation from the East. Constans II launched a failed campaign into southern Italy and was assassinated in 668. His presence in Sicily was resented by local elites and military officials alike. After his death, imperial control tightened, but local autonomy never disappeared. Over time, Sicily developed its own hybrid identity, politically Byzantine, culturally Mediterranean, and increasingly distinct from the imperial center. Sicily under Byzantine rule also became a contested religious space. Iconoclasm, the imperial ban on religious images imposed in the 8th century, divided clergy and laity. Many Sicilian monasteries resisted Constantinople's decrees, and some even aligned with the papacy in Rome, which opposed iconoclasm. Judith Herrin, Professor Emerita at King's College London, writes in her book Byzantium, The Surprising Life of a Medieval Empire. In Sicily, the tension between Rome and Constantinople was not abstract theology. It was pastoral, political, and cultural. The island became a canvas upon which the struggle for Christian orthodoxy was fought. This religious tension would prove consequential. By the early 9th century, weakened imperial authority and internal divisions left Sicily vulnerable to new threats from the south. For nearly 3 centuries, Sicily stood as Byzantium's western bastion, a Greek island in a Latin sea, a remnant of Rome ruled from Constantinople. But the stability of the empire would not last. From the shores of North Africa, a new power was rising, one that would transform Sicily once again, not through revival, but through revolution. In the next chapter, we explore the Islamic conquest of Sicily and the rise of the Emirate. In the 9th century, the Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake. From the deserts of Ifriqiya to the palaces of Baghdad, a new world had emerged, and it was coming for Sicily. This is the story of how an island long ruled by emperors was transformed into a Muslim emirate, not through sudden conquest, but through a century of relentless war, fragile alliances, and extraordinary cultural fusion. By the early 800s, Sicily stood at the edge of a crumbling imperial frontier. The Byzantine Empire, though still powerful, was increasingly overstretched. Repeated conflicts with the Lombards in Italy, iconoclast controversies within the church, and Arab raids across the eastern Mediterranean had left the empire vulnerable. Nowhere was this more evident than in Sicily. The island, long a jewel in the Byzantine crown, had become isolated, governed from afar, neglected in defence, and religiously divided. It was into this fractured world that the Muslim armies of North Africa advanced. Sarah Davis Secord writes, "The conquest of Sicily was not the product of a master plan, but of opportunism, exile, and empire. What began as a local revolt opened a century of warfare that redefined the island's identity. The Islamic conquest of Sicily began not with a foreign invasion, but with a local insurrection. In 826, a Byzantine fleet commander named Euphemius forcibly married a nun and was ordered to stand trial in Constantinople. Instead, he rebelled. After seizing Syracuse, he was defeated and fled to Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia, then ruled by the Aghlabid dynasty, a semi-independent emirate under the nominal authority of the Abbasid Caliphate. Seeking to reclaim Sicily for himself, Euphemius made a fateful offer. In exchange for military support, he would hand over the island to the Aghlabids. In 827, an Aghlabid force landed at Mazzara del Vallo, launching what would become a century-long conquest. Henri Bresque concludes, the Arab conquest of Sicily was less a military campaign than a process of sedimentation, a slow layering of forces, negotiated surrenders, sieges, and assimilation. Unlike the swift Islamic conquests of Spain or North Africa, Sicily resisted. Geography played a role. Mountainous interiors, fortified cities, and strategic coasts prolonged every campaign. But just as important were Byzantine counterattacks, civil strife among Muslim generals, and local populations switching allegiances depending on who offered security or autonomy. Key events unfolded across the century. Palermo fell in 831, becoming the capital of the new Islamic administration. Enna, in the island's mountainous centre, resisted until 859, finally taken after a brutal siege. Syracuse, the old Byzantine capital, fell in 878 after an extended assault that ended centuries of Greek political dominance. Taormina, the last major Byzantine stronghold, fell in 902, effectively completing the conquest, though scattered outposts remained. Jeremy Johns, professor of the art and archaeology of the Islamic Mediterranean University of Oxford, writes in Arabic Administration in Norman Sicily, "The Aghlabid conquest of Sicily was not an imposition of power over the island, but a negotiation of power within it. Arab rule was made possible by the collapse of Byzantine networks as much as by military strength. Throughout this period, conflict was punctuated by truces, local pacts, and mutual raids. The shifting alliances, including Sicilian Greeks who collaborated with Muslims to settle local disputes, underscore the pragmatic nature of survival on the island. By the early 10th century, Sicily had transformed into a fully Islamic polity under the rule of the Aghlabid Emirate, later absorbed by the Fatimid Caliphate. The capital was established at Palermo, which rapidly expanded into one of the most prosperous cities in the Western Islamic world, rivaling Cordoba and Cairo in size and sophistication. Hiroshi Takayama observes, Palermo under Muslim rule was not merely a provincial capital, it was a metropolitan hub of Islamic learning, trade, and architecture, a beacon that cast its light across Christian and Muslim seas alike. The Emirate introduced sweeping changes. Arabic became the dominant language of administration and literature. Islamic law, Sharia, governed public life, though non-Muslims were granted dhimmi status, allowing religious freedom in exchange for a tax, jizya. Agriculture was transformed by the introduction of new crops, citrus fruits, sugarcane, cotton, pistachios, dates. Supported by advanced irrigation systems, markets flourished, linking Sicily to trade routes from Cairo to Kairouan, from Constantinople to the Maghreb. Yet coexistence persisted. Sicily's Christian and Jewish communities were not destroyed but adapted, sometimes thriving, sometimes subjugated. Monasteries paid taxes. Greek and Latin remained in liturgical use. A multi-ethnic elite emerged, fluent in Greek, Arabic and Latin. Alexander Metcalfe, senior lecturer in Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, University of Lancaster, writes in his monumental work, The Muslims of Medieval Italy, far from annihilating what came before, Muslim Sicily absorbed and reorganized it. The Emirate did not erase the island's past. It reorganized it into a new cultural grammar. The Emirate's religious structure reflected a pragmatic pluralism. While Islam was dominant, Christian bishops remained in office, and Greek Orthodox rites continued in many churches. Jews, too, found space in urban centers, often serving as doctors, merchants, and scribes. Palermo boasted over 300 mosques by the 10th century, alongside churches and synagogues. It was a cosmopolitan city, home to Berbers, Arabs, Persians, Greeks, Lombards, and Jews, a living microcosm of the Mediterranean. Michele Amari, 19th century Sicilian historian and Arabist, wrote in his book Storia dei Musulmani di Sicilia, under Arab rule, Sicily became a mirror of the Islamic world, not its twin, but its reflection, shaped by conquest and compromise. Its cities spoke in many tongues but beat to a single rhythm. By the late 10th century, the Emirate faced mounting internal problems. Rebellions erupted in the eastern parts of the island, where Greek Christian communities remained strong. The ruling Aghlabids were overthrown by the Fatimids, a Shia dynasty who governed through distant proxies. Berber versus Arab rivalries, disputes over taxation, and contested emir appointments led to political fragmentation. As local emirs fought each other, Sicily became vulnerable once more, not to Byzantium this time, but to a rising power from the north, the Normans. For over a century, Muslim Sicily thrived as a Mediterranean beacon, urban, multilingual, and intellectually alive. Yet internal fractures would leave the Emirate exposed. From the Christian kingdoms of southern Italy, a new wave of warriors was watching. In the next chapter, the sons of the Vikings return as conquerors. The Norman invasion of Sicily was about to begin. In the 11th century, a new power landed on Sicilian shores, not from the east, but from the north. They were neither emperors nor caliphs. They were outsiders, Norse by blood, Frankish by culture, and Latin by faith. And yet, in just a few decades, these Norman adventurers would build one of the most cosmopolitan and sophisticated kingdoms of the medieval world. This is not merely the story of conquest, it is the story of reinvention. By the middle of the 11th century, the Islamic Emirate of Sicily, once a beacon of Mediterranean power, was politically fractured and militarily vulnerable. The Fatimid Caliphate, now ruling from Cairo, had lost interest in the western periphery of its domain. Local emirs feuded over power. Christian rebellions smouldered in the eastern highlands. It was into this volatile landscape that the Normans arrived. These Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in Normandy a century earlier, had already begun carving out territories in southern Italy. What began as mercenary service to Lombards and Byzantines soon evolved into full-scale conquest. David Abulafia, professor of Mediterranean history at the University of Cambridge, writes in his great book, The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean. The Norman conquest of Sicily was not simply a collision between Christianity and Islam. It was the absorption of a Mediterranean frontier by a northern military elite eager to exploit, not extinguish, the world they encountered. The conquest of Sicily began in 1061, when Robert Guiscard, Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and his younger brother Roger de Hauteville landed near Messina. They came with a small force, perhaps only a few hundred knights, but were soon aided by disaffected Greek Christians and ambitious warlords hoping to exploit the weakening Emirate. The conquest would take 30 years. City by city, castle by castle, the Normans advanced. Palermo, the Emirate's capital, fell in 1072 after a long siege. Trapani, Mazzara and Agrigento were taken through negotiated surrenders. The final stronghold, Noto, fell in 1091, marking the end of Muslim political rule in Sicily. Hiroshi Takayama observes, "The Norman conquest was not a war of extermination, it was a campaign of gradual encroachment, where pragmatic alliances and religious toleration were wielded as effectively as steel." Following the conquest, Roger I ruled as Count of Sicily, under the nominal authority of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Yet in practice, he governed independently. He preserved much of the Islamic administrative apparatus, including tax systems, court protocol, and the use of Arabic in official documents. He permitted Muslims to keep their mosques, Greeks their churches, and Jews their synagogues, as long as they recognized Norman sovereignty and paid taxes. Jeremy Johns writes, "Roger's genius lay in conservation. He did not dismantle the Islamic state he conquered, he ruled it. The continuities between emirate and county were not accidental. They were essential to legitimacy. Under Roger, the foundations were laid for a tricultural kingdom, Latin Christian at its apex, but incorporating Greek, Arab, and Jewish elements at every level of society." The most iconic figure in Norman Sicilian history is Roger II, son of Roger I. Crowned King of Sicily in 1130 in Palermo, he united all Norman territories in southern Italy and the island into one political unit. His court was among the most cosmopolitan in Europe. He employed Muslim administrators, Greek Orthodox theologians, Latin scholars, and Jewish physicians. His chief advisor, George of Antioch, a Greek Christian, held the Arabic title Amir al-Umara, Commander of Commanders. Roger's court commissioned maps, scientific translations, and architectural projects inspired by Islamic and Byzantine models. Alex Metcalfe observes, "Roger II created a court without parallel in Latin Europe, one that could speak in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. His kingdom was not merely a Christian victory, but a Mediterranean synthesis. The kingdom's capital, Palermo, flourished. With its Zeli mosaics, Muqarnas ceilings, and Byzantine domes, it became a cultural bridge between East and West. While the Norman rulers promoted religious pluralism, it was never equality. Muslims and Jews were subject to special taxes, and Christians held preferential legal status. But compared to other parts of medieval Europe, Sicily stood apart. It was a place where diversity was administered rather than suppressed. John Julius Norwich writes, "The Norman kingdom of Sicily was an extraordinary anomaly, an island where Muslim calligraphers illuminated Christian Bibles, where Arab astronomers advised a Latin king, and where tolerance was policy, not myth. The royal chancery produced documents in Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. The administration was layered, not homogenized, reflecting the reality of a population divided by faith and language, but united by law and economy." Roger II died in 1154, leaving behind a prosperous and admired kingdom. His successors, however, lacked his vision and strength. By the late 12th century, the Norman dynasty was replaced by the Hohenstaufen, beginning with Emperor Henry VI, husband of Roger's granddaughter Constance. But the legacy of the Normans remained. They proved that a militarized Latin elite could govern a multi-ethnic society without annihilating it. They left behind an architectural heritage visible in churches like Monreal Cathedral and the Palatine Chapel, where Latin, Greek, and Arabic inscriptions coexist. Their hybrid administration influenced later rulers, including the Hohenstaufen, the Angevins, and even Frederick II, who saw himself as heir to Roger's vision. Ernst Kantorowicz, former professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, in his book Frederick II, observes, "Frederick II inherited from the Normans not only a kingdom but an idea, that one ruler could stand at the crossroads of civilizations, synthesizing their knowledge into sovereignty." The Norman kingdom of Sicily lasted just over a century, but its legacy endured for generations, not in military might, but in the unprecedented experiment of cultural coexistence. From Latin kings and Arab scribes, from Byzantine mosaics to Muslim astronomy, Sicily became not just a kingdom, but a mirror of the Mediterranean itself. In the next chapter, we trace the fortunes of Sicily as it passed through dynastic hands, from Hohenstaufen emperors to Angevin and Aragonese rule, and witness the slow erosion of the world the Normans built. What happens when a kingdom born in cultural fusion becomes a prize in imperial war? After the Normans, Sicily stood as a beacon of tolerance and hybrid governance. But in the 13th century, this island paradise was drawn into the power struggles of emperors, popes, and foreign dynasties. What followed was brilliance, betrayal, and bloodshed. With the death of King William II in 1189, the Norman dynasty of Sicily came to an end. The island, once a proud and independent kingdom forged in multicultural brilliance, now became a prized pawn in the chessboard of European power. The line of succession was contested, and the first to act was Henry VI, the German Hohenstaufen emperor married to Constance, the last legitimate Norman heiress. In 1194, Henry VI invaded Sicily and seized the throne. Though his rule was short-lived, he died just 3 years later, the Hohenstaufen dynasty was now in place. And with it came the most enigmatic ruler of medieval Sicily, Frederick II. David Abulafia, professor of Mediterranean history at the University of Cambridge, writes in his book Frederick II, a Medieval Emperor. Frederick II was both a German emperor and a Sicilian monarch, and yet he was fully at home in neither world. His reign reveals the tensions of ruling a Latin Christian kingdom infused with Arab, Greek, and Jewish traditions. Crowned King of Sicily in 1198, Holy Roman Emperor in 1220, Frederick ruled for over half a century. Raised in Palermo, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, Frederick embraced the intellectual inheritance of Norman Sicily and magnified it. He was a patron of science, astronomy, and medicine, a legislator who compiled the Liber Augustalis, one of the earliest centralized law codes in Europe, a founder of the University of Naples, a ruler who maintained a multilingual chancery and a court teeming with philosophers, scientists, and poets, both Christian and Muslim. Yet his reign was also marked by deep conflict. The papacy viewed him with suspicion, calling him the Antichrist. His imperial ambitions in Italy and the Holy Land led to excommunications, crusades, and eventually a full-scale papal war against the Hohenstaufen. Ernst Kantorowicz, former professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, writes in his book Frederick II, Frederick's Sicily was not merely ruled, it was curated. It stood as an experiment in rational monarchy, one that tried to marry imperial authority with a Mediterranean pluralism never seen before or since. Frederick died in 1250. His heirs, including his illegitimate son Manfred, struggled to hold the kingdom against papal hostility. The dream of a Hohenstaufen Mediterranean empire was dying, and the Pope was eager to bury it. The papacy invited a French noble, Charles of Anjou, brother of King Louis IX of France, to claim Sicily. With papal blessing, Charles defeated and killed Manfred at the Battle of Benevento in 1266 and established Angevin rule. Charles brought with him not only armies but a new vision of rule, centralized, exploitative, and foreign. Unlike the Hohenstaufen, the Angevins had no cultural ties to Sicily. French officials replaced local elites. Taxes soared. The island was drained to fund Charles's wars in the Balkans and crusades in the east. Resentment built quickly. The tipping point came on Easter Monday, 1282, in Palermo. Stephen Runciman, renowned British Byzantinist, writes in his famous book The Sicilian Vespers, a history of the Mediterranean world in the later 13th century. The Sicilian Vespers was not a revolt against monarchy. It was a revolt against foreign rule, a violent outcry from a people who had once been governed with respect and now found themselves humiliated. The Sicilian Vespers, a spontaneous uprising against the Angevins, began on 30 March 1282 with the killing of a French soldier in Palermo. The violence spread rapidly. Within 6 weeks, nearly every French soldier and official on the island had been killed or expelled. The rebels turned to Peter III of Aragon, who claimed the Sicilian crown through his marriage to Constance, daughter of Manfred. He landed with a fleet, was crowned king, and thus began over a century of Aragonese rule in Sicily. Clifford R. Bachman, professor of history at Boston University, writes, "With the Vespers, Sicily declared not only its independence from France, but from papal control. In choosing a king of Aragon, the island aligned itself with the Mediterranean once more, and against the ambitions of Rome. The War of the Vespers led to a permanent split. Sicily, under Aragonese rule, became the Kingdom of Trinacria. Southern Italy, under the Angevins, remained the Kingdom of Naples. Though both kingdoms claimed continuity from the original Norman monarchy, their fates diverged. Sicily remained tied to the crown of Aragon and later the Spanish Empire, while Naples evolved into a battlefield of French and Spanish ambition. The Aragonese retained the multicultural legacy of earlier rulers, albeit with diminishing tolerance. Over time, Muslims were converted or expelled. Jews were increasingly marginalized, leading to mass expulsions in the late 15th century. Latin Christianity became dominant. Though Greek-speaking communities survived in the East, Luis Mendola, Sicilian-American historian and linguist, writes, in his interesting book, The Peoples of Sicily, Aragonese Sicily maintained a facade of multiculturalism, but behind it loomed a darker truth, the gradual erasure of the Norman Hohenstaufen synthesis under the weight of orthodoxy and imperial conformity. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, Sicily remained under the authority of the Aragonese crown. While periods of stability allowed for economic recovery, especially in agriculture and trade, political instability and feudal fragmentation weakened central governance. Palermo, once a global metropolis, declined in importance. Feudal barons rose in power, often resisting royal directives. And Sicily, increasingly overshadowed by Naples and Barcelona, became a provincial outpost rather than a Mediterranean capital. Still, the memory of its unique past lingered. Islamic irrigation systems remained in use. Greek churches still dotted the landscape. Arabic place names persisted in local dialects. Legal texts from the Hohenstaufen era were still cited in royal courts. Donald Matthew, emeritus professor of history at the University of Reading, writes, "Sicily never forgot what it had been, not entirely. Even in decline, its landscape and language bore the fingerprints of every empire it had known. Few medieval lands carried so many identities in their soil. From the imperial experiments of Frederick II to the brutal rule of the Angevins and the reluctant protection of Aragon, Sicily's medieval fate was never its own. Yet through these centuries of conquest and rebellion, the island retained its voice, a voice shaped by Latin law, Greek ritual, Arab science, and Norman ambition. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to explore our other videos, including the complete history of Islam and the rise of the Normans. For more in-depth journeys through medieval history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next chapter.